The cashier smiled politely. "I'm sorry. Your card has been declined." I tried another one, then another. Same message. My phone buzzed before I could speak. It was a text from my own son. "Dad, I've taken control of the family finances. It's time someone started making responsible decisions." I stared at the screen. Not because I was worried about money. Because he had absolutely no idea whose name was actually behind everything he thought he controlled. My name is Jabari Adeyemi, a 63-year-old semi-retired investment strategist. For more than 30 years, I built businesses, advised companies, and carefully planned my family's future. My wife passed away 6 years ago, leaving me to raise our only son, Tendai, into adulthood. After university, Tendai joined the family office to learn how our investments worked. I intentionally gave him increasing responsibility because I wanted him to earn confidence, not inherit entitlement. He was intelligent, ambitious, and eager to prove himself. Somewhere along the way, confidence quietly became certainty. Then certainty became control. The day he blocked my credit cards, he believed he was teaching his father a lesson. He never realized he was about to learn one himself. When I arrived home that evening, I noticed the house was unusually quiet. One of the staff members politely told me that Tendai was waiting for me in my study. I walked in and saw him sitting behind the desk with a thick folder filled with financial reports, bank statements, and printed charts. He looked calm and confident, almost as if he had been preparing for this conversation for a long time. He stood up, greeted me, and asked me to take a seat. There was no anger in his voice. He spoke as though he was simply explaining a business decision. "Dad," he said, "I've made a few changes to protect our family's money." I looked at him without saying anything. He opened the folder and started pointing at different documents. He explained that he had canceled all of my credit cards, reduced my access to several family accounts, and instructed the household office that any large expense would now need his approval first. He even said that the finance team had already been informed about the new process. He called it modernizing the family's finances. He told me that I had become too generous over the years. He believed I gave too much money to relatives who never learned to stand on their own. He also questioned the donations I regularly made to charities and community projects. In his mind, cutting unnecessary spending was the only way to protect the family's future. He never sounded rude. In fact, he truly believed he was doing the right thing. That was what made the moment so surprising. I waited until he finished speaking, then asked only one question. "Who authorized you to make those changes?" He smiled with complete confidence. That smile told me everything I needed to know. Somewhere along the way, my son had stopped believing he was helping me. He had started believing he was already in charge. It did not take long for the news to spread through the family. By the next morning, almost everyone seemed to know that Tendai had taken control of my credit cards and changed the way the family finances were being managed. I had not called anyone to talk about it, but somehow every relative already had an opinion. It was surprising how quickly people chose a side without asking what had really happened. My older sister was the first to call. She sounded pleased as she spoke to me. "At last," she said, "Tendai is acting like a real leader. Every family needs someone who can make the hard decisions." I listened quietly and thanked her for calling. I did not argue with her. Later that day, several cousins started sending messages in our family group chat. Most of them agreed with Tendai. They said younger people understood modern finance better than older generations. They believed he was simply bringing fresh ideas and better discipline into the family. Some even congratulated him for being brave enough to make changes that nobody else wanted to make. I read every message without replying. The more they talked, the clearer it became that almost none of them knew the full story. They were judging the situation based on rumors instead of facts. Only one person stayed completely calm. My accountant, Mr. Dlamini, had worked with me for more than 25 years. He knew every investment, every business agreement, and every family rule we had created over the years. During a small family meeting, everyone expected him to support either me or Tendai. Instead, he quietly asked one simple question. "Has anyone here actually read the family's governance documents?" The room became silent for a moment. Nobody answered him. He did not defend my decisions. He did not criticize Tendai either. He simply repeated the same question again. "Has anyone taken the time to read the documents before deciding who is right?" Still, nobody answered. Everyone had strong opinions. Everyone believed they understood the situation. Yet not one person had opened the files that explained how the family office actually worked. At that moment, I realized something important. People often choose sides because of emotions, not because of facts. And sometimes the truth stays hidden, simply because nobody is willing to read what is already written in front of them. I did not argue with Tendai after hearing what the rest of the family had to say. I did not ask him to give back my credit cards, and I did not tell the bank to undo his changes. That surprised everyone. They expected a loud argument between father and son. Instead, I stayed calm. The next morning, I invited Tendai into my study. He walked in with the same confidence he had shown the day before. He probably thought I had finally accepted that he was ready to take charge. I smiled and said, "If you truly believe you are ready to manage everything, then I want to give you the opportunity." His eyes lit up. "I want you to handle every financial responsibility for the next 7 days," I said. "Every decision, every payment, every problem. I won't interfere unless you ask." He agreed immediately. "I can do that," he replied without any hesitation. He believed this would be his chance to prove to everyone that he was the right person to lead the family's finances. I handed him a folder, but this one was very different from the reports he had shown me. Inside was a list of everything that had to be managed during the week. There was payroll for employees who depended on their salaries to support their families. There were tax payments that had strict deadlines. There were business agreements that required careful attention before any money could be released. There were scholarship commitments for young students whose school fees had already been promised. There were maintenance costs for several family properties that could not simply be ignored. I told him, "These are only the responsibilities for this week. Every week brings something different." He looked through the pages and nodded with confidence. "I understand," he said. I simply smiled. What he saw on those pages looked like numbers, dates, and payments. What he could not yet see were the people connected to every single decision. Behind every payment was a family waiting for a salary. Behind every agreement was years of trust. Behind every scholarship was a student hoping for a better future. Money was never just about moving funds from one account to another. It was about keeping promises. As Tendai walked out of my study with the folder in his hands, he believed he was walking towards victory. I watched him leave, knowing that the next 7 days would teach him a lesson no spreadsheet ever could. The first day went exactly as Tendai expected. He checked reports, approved routine payments, answered emails, and attended online meetings with confidence. By the end of the day, he looked pleased with himself. When we met briefly that evening, he smiled and said, "Everything is under control." I simply nodded. But by the third day, things began to change. The phone started ringing more often than usual. An office manager called because several employees needed an urgent decision about their salaries after a banking issue delayed part of the payroll. They were worried because many of them had rent, school fees, and household bills due that week. They could not wait another few days. Tendai realized that delaying one payment affected dozens of families, not just one company account. A few hours later, another message arrived. A community health project we had supported for many years was waiting for its scheduled funding. The payment had already been promised months earlier. Doctors were expecting new medical supplies, and local families were depending on those services. Tendai looked at the figures and wondered if the payment could be postponed. Then he read the agreement. Delaying the money would also delay the delivery of important equipment. For the first time, he understood that one decision on a computer screen could affect many people he had never even met. Before he could finish dealing with that problem, one of our oldest business partners requested approval for another agreement. It was connected to a contract my late wife and I had signed many years before. The agreement was built on trust that had taken decades to earn. Tendai searched through the files and finally realized that every commitment was connected to another one. Changing one payment could create problems somewhere else. Nothing stood alone. By the end of the week, the neat spreadsheets he loved no longer looked simple. They showed numbers, but they did not explain the stories behind them. They did not show the employees waiting for salaries, the students depending on scholarships, the families receiving medical care, or the business partners who had trusted our word for years. That was the lesson he had never expected. Managing wealth was not about saying no to spending or keeping as much money as possible. It was about knowing why every promise had been made and making sure those promises were honored. For the first time, Tendai stopped looking at the family finances as a collection of numbers. He started seeing the people behind every decision. On the fifth day, Tendai was looking for an old business contract that one of our partners had requested. He searched through the shelves in my study, opening one cabinet after another. Most of the files were neatly organized and clearly labeled. Then, at the back of one cabinet, he noticed a small wooden box and a row of old notebooks. He carefully picked one up. They were my late wife's handwritten journals. For a long moment, he simply stood there. He had not seen those journals since the days before she became ill. He slowly placed them back where they belonged. Next to the journals was a blue folder that immediately caught his attention. Across the front were the words, "Family Stewardship Plan." Curious, he opened it. Inside were carefully arranged documents that my wife and I had prepared over many years. There were personal letters to our future family, legal instructions, investment principles, and notes explaining why certain financial decisions had been made. Every page showed that nothing in our family had been built by accident. Every choice had a purpose. As he continued reading, one sentence stood out more than anything else. It had been highlighted in bold. "Ownership is temporary. Stewardship is earned every day." He stopped reading for a moment and looked at those words again. Then he turned the next page. There was a letter from my wife explaining that money could easily create pride if people forgot that it was meant to serve others, not control them. She wrote that real leadership was never about having the most authority. It was about carrying the greatest responsibility with honesty and humility. Tendai kept reading. He did not rush through a single page. By the time I returned home that evening, every document had been carefully placed back into the blue folder. When I walked into the study, he was sitting quietly in the chair where he had confidently announced his financial changes only a few days earlier. This time, there was no confident smile. He looked thoughtful. He looked humble. Without saying a single word, I could see that something inside him had begun to change. The following Monday, Tendai and I left home together to attend the quarterly meeting of our family office. During the drive, he looked calm and confident again, although much quieter than he had been a few days earlier. He carried his folder of reports and notes, ready to present his ideas. I could tell he believed this meeting would be the moment everyone officially recognized him as the person leading the family's finances. When we entered the boardroom, the directors, legal advisors, and senior managers were already waiting. They smiled warmly and greeted both of us. After everyone had taken their seats, the chairperson welcomed the group and began the meeting. The first reports were directed to me, just as they had always been. The finance director gave an update on the investments. The legal advisor explained the progress of several long-term agreements. The property manager discussed ongoing maintenance projects. After each report, they looked at me for final comments before moving to the next item. Tendai sat quietly, expecting that at any moment the chairperson would invite him to take over. Instead, the chairperson turned towards him with a polite smile. "Tendai," he said, "we're very pleased that you're becoming more involved in the family office. Please observe today's meeting carefully. It will help you understand how everything works." Tendai looked surprised but nodded. As the meeting continued, he finally understood what had really happened. Although I had given him operational authority to manage daily financial activities, I had never given him controlling authority over the family's wealth. Those were two very different responsibilities. The family office had been carefully designed many years before, when my wife and I first began planning for the future. Together with trusted advisors, we created a system that could protect the family for generations. Important decisions were never left in the hands of one person. Every major investment required several approvals. Legal agreements were reviewed by independent advisors. Trustees, board members, and governance rules all worked together to protect the family. No single signature could control everything, not even mine. As the meeting came to an end, Tendai slowly closed his notebook. For the first time, he understood that real leadership was never about having complete control. It was about working within a system built on trust, responsibility, and accountability. That truth was far more powerful than anything he had imagined. That evening, after we returned home from the meeting, the house was quiet. We both walked into the study, but this time it felt very different from the day Tendai had first sat behind my desk and announced all the changes he had made. He placed his notebook on the table and remained silent for a long moment. I waited. I did not want to fill the silence with another lesson. Finally, he looked at me. There was no confidence in his voice now. There was no need to prove himself. He simply asked, "Dad, why didn't you stop me on the first day?" It was the first real question he had asked since all of this began. I looked at him and answered honestly, "Because advice teaches less than experience." He listened carefully without interrupting. "If I had stopped you the moment you canceled my credit cards," I continued, "you would probably have thought I was protecting my position. You might have believed I didn't trust you or didn't want you to grow." He slowly nodded. "But by letting you carry the responsibility yourself, you discovered things that I could never explain with words alone." I reminded him about the employees waiting for their salaries, the students depending on scholarships, the health project that needed funding, and the old business agreements built on years of trust. "You didn't just read about those responsibilities," I said. "You lived through them." He lowered his eyes. "I understand now," he said quietly. "I thought managing money meant controlling spending. I never realized it meant protecting people and keeping promises." I smiled. "That is the difference between managing accounts and leading a family." For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then Tendai looked at me again. "I'm sorry, Dad. I truly believed I was doing the right thing." "I know," I replied. "Making a mistake does not define a person. Refusing to learn from it does." He took a deep breath and gave a small smile. That evening, I realized my son had gained something much more valuable than financial knowledge. He had gained humility. And I knew that lesson would stay with him far longer than anything I could have told him on the very first day. The next morning, I asked Tendai to meet me in my study once again. This time, I was not giving him another challenge. I wanted to show him something that he had never seen before. I unlocked a small cabinet and took out a large folder. It contained the original documents that my wife and I had prepared many years earlier, long before Tendai had joined the family office. I placed the folder on the desk and opened it slowly. Inside were trust documents, business agreements, partnership contracts, investment plans, and letters explaining why each decision had been made. Every paper represented years of careful planning. My wife and I had always known that one day we would no longer be here. That was why we built a system that could protect the family long after we were gone. I looked at Tendai and said, "Our family's wealth was never built around bank accounts." He looked surprised. I continued, "Bank accounts can change. Credit cards can be canceled. Online access can be blocked. Those things make life easier, but they are not the real foundation of our family." I pointed to the documents in front of him. "Our future depends on these businesses, these trusts, these partnerships, and the promises we have kept for many years. They were designed to last longer than both your mother and me." He carefully turned the pages, reading each document with great attention. Then I said something I wanted him to remember for the rest of his life. "Credit cards are only a convenience. They are not power." He quietly nodded. "Access is not ownership," I continued. "And control is not leadership." He looked at me with a completely different expression than he had a week earlier. At last, he understood. The greatest strength of our family had never been the money we owned. It had always been the trust we built with each other, our business partners, and the people who depended on our word. Without that trust, no legal document, no investment, and no financial system could ever keep a family together. That was the true inheritance I wanted to leave behind. Over the next few days, several relatives called to ask what I was going to do with Tendai. Some believed I should remove him from every financial responsibility. Others said I should never allow him near the family office again. They thought he had gone too far by making such important decisions without asking me first. I listened to every opinion, but I had already made my decision. One morning, I invited Tendai to my study again. He walked in quietly, expecting that I was about to take away all of his responsibilities. Instead, I placed a notebook on the desk and smiled. "I have another job for you," I said. He looked surprised. "I want you to help me rewrite our family's governance policies for the next generation." For a moment, he simply stared at me. "You still trust me?" he asked softly. "I trust the man who has learned from his mistakes," I replied. "That is far more valuable than someone who has never been tested." We spent the next several weeks working side by side. We carefully reviewed every policy, every rule, and every process that guided the family office. Whenever we found something that could create confusion, we improved it together. This time, nothing was based on assumptions. Everything was written clearly. We agreed that every major financial decision should involve discussion before action. No one would make important changes alone, no matter how experienced they were. We also agreed that every responsibility must come with accountability. If someone accepted a role, they also accepted the duty to explain their decisions honestly and openly. As we worked together, I noticed something had changed in Tendai. He no longer rushed to prove that he was the smartest person in the room. He asked questions. He listened carefully. He welcomed advice instead of rejecting it. That gave me more confidence than any financial report ever could. By the time we finished updating the policies, I realized we had built something even stronger than before. Leadership in our family would no longer be treated as something a person automatically received because of their name or position. It would become something earned through wisdom, honesty, responsibility, and daily actions. That was the kind of legacy worth passing on. Several months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. The family office was running smoothly, our meetings were more open, and every important decision was discussed together before anyone took action. The tension that had once filled our conversations had been replaced by respect and understanding. One afternoon, after we finished a meeting at the office, Tendai walked into my study holding a small envelope. He smiled awkwardly and placed it on my desk. "I think this belongs to you," he said. I opened the envelope and found a new credit card with my name on it. For a moment, I looked at the card and then back at my son. I couldn't help but laugh. The credit card had never been the real issue. It was only a piece of plastic. The real lesson had never been about bank accounts or spending limits. It had been about trust, responsibility, and understanding what it truly meant to lead a family. I looked at Tendai and saw someone very different from the young man who had once believed that controlling the money meant controlling everything. That person was gone. Now he listened before making decisions. He asked questions instead of making assumptions. He understood that every financial choice affected real people, not just numbers on a screen. As we walked out of the office together that evening, I felt proud in a way that had nothing to do with money or business success. I realized that the greatest gift I could ever leave my son was not hidden inside investment accounts, company shares, or valuable property. Those things could be gained, lost, or divided over time. But wisdom was different. Good character was different. If he protected those, he would always find a way to rebuild anything life took from him. Money could create opportunities. It could build companies, buy homes, and provide security. But it could never replace honesty. It could never replace humility. And it could never keep a family together without trust. As we reached the car, Tendai smiled at me. This time, I wasn't proud because he knew how to manage wealth. I was proud because he had learned how to carry responsibility with humility. That was the greatest inheritance I could ever leave behind, and I knew it would remain with him long after every investment and every business had changed hands. The strongest families aren't led by the person with the most authority. They're guided by the person who understands that trust is worth more than any account balance. Because wealth can be transferred in a day. Character takes a lifetime to build. If your own child suddenly took control of your finances, how would you have responded? Would you have fought back immediately or taught the lesson another way? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more emotional family dramas filled with unforgettable twists and powerful life lessons.